Welcome back to Mishnah in Depth for a new Masachet. This is Mishnah in Depth Shevuot with Shalhevet Schwartz. The Mishnah in Depth series is part of the Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and is sponsored by her family in her memory. And thank you for joining Shalhevet Schwartz this Sunday for the next few weeks. This course is following the daily Mishnah Yomit study schedule, where you will individually study 1 or 2 mishnayot a day on your own and come together with a group of learners to review, dive in depth, and look at things more closely with a group of fellow learners. For those who have not had the pleasure of learning with her, Shalhevet Schwartz is a student in the Kollel Iyun V'Halacha at Yeshivat Drisha in Kfar Etzion. Before she came to Drisha, she served as a research and program coordinator at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. And she is a graduate of Yale University, and she had spent several summers working in experiential Jewish education at Camp Stone, and recently at roles of Rosh Mashava and Rosh Beit Midrash. She has also taught in various settings, including a Talmud Shir at Columbia University, and currently with Hadran as part of the Beyond the Daf project. Sources will be shared for today's class as slides on screen. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Shalhevet.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Shalhevet, and I'm really excited for the opportunity to learn Masechet Shevuot together with all of you. I also just want to say it is a huge zchut to be learning in a project that is in memory of Rifka Rosenwein. I didn't have the opportunity to know her when she was alive, but I am a friend of several of her children, and I'm really thrilled to be having the opportunity to be learning Mishnah in her memory. With that, just can I get a quick show of hands of who here has been kind of following the Mishnah Yomit shiurim with Drisha from previous Masechtot? Who is coming? Any show of hands coming back? Okay, so we've got some people, some veteran returnees and several who are new. I just want to say a quick kind of a few things about how this is going to go more broadly over the next 5 weeks. And then hopefully we'll be able to dive right in. So I think as a sort of broad zoom out perspective, when we're learning Mishnah, I think there are a lot of different ways that people tend to approach, right, what does it mean to learn Mishnah? And I think really we can sort of divide those approaches into 2 categories broadly. I think there are those who really want to look at Mishnah as a text in and of itself, to think about its structure literarily, what it's doing, really study the Mishnah as a text. And then I think there's an approach that takes a look at really uses the text of the Mishnah and the Mishnah itself as a springboard for thinking about the biblical and rabbinic or the halachic tradition more broadly, and thinking about these issues and these concepts as they show up throughout rabbinic literature, looking at mishnayot, and then looking at how those questions develop through the Gemara and the Rishonim, thinking about them in conversation even with their biblical antecedents. And throughout the 5 weeks to come, I think we're going to be doing a little bit of both. I'll say that today, because in the Mishnah Yomit schedule, I believe the only Mishnah of Masechet Shevuot that you will have learned up till through today is the first Mishnah, which we're going to go over together. So really, people haven't had a chance to see that much of the content. So really what today I think is going to be an overview of a lot of the kind of core general things that we're going to see, and use that really as an opportunity to think of the Masechet really as a text as a whole, and to ask a couple of questions about why that text is built the way it is, and what that can come to teach us about the institution of the Shevuah, right, the institution of the oath. This Masechet has nothing to do with the holiday, with the institution of the oath as it shows up in rabbinic literature, and really what the way that this Masechet is built is trying to tell us, as really a way into the Masechet that then hopefully you'll be able to start learning with maybe a different perspective on. Up till then, clear? Yeah. Okay. A couple of other things. I'm going to be doing this via a slideshow that I'll put up in a minute, but in terms of questions, really feel free to break in at any time with questions. In addition, I will hopefully be stopping at different points throughout this year to see if there are any questions. But if you have a question, I should, even when I have the slides up, be able to mostly see you if you want to raise your actual hands. If you want to do the raise hand function in the chat, you can do that too. Hopefully I'll see it. And if you have your hand up and it looks and it seems like I'm not noticing, just you can also feel free to break in if you want to. And the last thing is just that there'll be text up on the slides at various points, and because it is sometimes hard to talk straight for an hour, I might ask for some volunteer readers at various points. So I'm pretty sure almost all the texts are up here in both English and Hebrew, and if you would like to read, you should feel free to do that in whatever language you are most comfortable. Okay, so with that, today we're going to be really doing an overview of the different kinds of Shevuot, the different kinds of oaths that show up in the Masechet, really understand in a broad sense, in a kind of a very broad survey sense, what each parak is talking about. And then as we do that, and as we sort of start to look at how this Masechet looks, we're going to realize, I think, that there are a lot of things that are not so intuitive about the way that this Masechet is built, starting really right off with the first Mishnah, which we're going to look at in a moment. And with that, I think we're going to raise a number of questions that hopefully over the course of the next little under an hour, we're going to be able to answer. So with that, I'm going to put up the slideshow. Everyone can see it? Great. And I just want to make sure that I can see everyone.
Yeah.
Okay, I think.
Yep.
Yeah.
I can see it.
Great. And I think I can see you guys too. So far, so good. All right. So we are going to, Masechet Shevuot begins with an interesting Mishnah, in that it lists a whole bunch of things, not all of which are Shevuot, but this is the Mishnah that is sometimes known as the Shtayim Shehin Arba Mishnah. Would someone like to read this first Mishnah? Anyone? Emily, go for it. Yeah. And just a reminder to unmute yourself if you're talking. Okay.
Sure. Shevuot, shtayim shehen arba, yediot hatum'ah, shtayim shehen arba, yetziot hashabbat, shtayim shehen arba, mar'ot nigaim, shtayim shehen arba'ah.
Okay, amazing. So this is a list of 4 things. The number 4 shows up a lot here in the Masechet. 4 things, for each of which there are 2 that are 4, meaning these are going to be items that have that split into 4 categories, basically split into, if you imagine a tree like a category tree, so it has it splits into 2, and then each of that 2 splits into 2. And this really, it's in some ways a really beautiful example, and you see this all over throughout the Mishnah. I don't know if people were here for Megillah, but if people saw the Ein Bains, that's another really famous example of it. But this really reminds, I think, these kinds of mishnayot are a reminder of the original orality of the text, meaning that the Mishnah was a text that was originally not written down. It was these texts were originally passed down orally from person to person, and therefore a lot of the ways the texts are constructed are in such a way that make things kind of roll off the tongue easily. The way that kids memorize the parshiot hashavua by singing songs. So too, right here, we've got a list of a bunch of things that are each shtayim shein arba. If people learn Masechet Shabbat, so yitziot hashabbat, let's say like bringing things in and out of the public domain, right? That can go in either direction. It can be picking up or putting down, so it splits into 2 that are 4. That's an example. These 4 things, not all of them take up space in our Masechet, and only one of them is Shevuot. So yitziot hashabbat, we don't see, it shows up here, but we don't see it anymore in our Masechet. And mar'ot negaim, which are the like different ways that a tzara'at blemish can look, different ways that leprosy can look, also doesn't show up anymore in the Mishnah in our Masechet. But both Shevuot and Yediot HaTum'ah do. Now, Shevuot oaths, so far pretty self-explanatory, although obviously we'll realize that concept is not actually as self-explanatory as we thought. But Yediot HaTum'ah, right, what does it how does the translation have it? Awareness of the defiling. That's not a very clear concept just right off the bat. So just to clarify what it means, a person who is ritually impure is not allowed to walk into the temple or eat food that is or consume food that is has been given kind of like temple level sanctity. And if one does that by mistake, under certain circumstances, someone has to someone's liable to bring a certain kind of sacrifice. But that only happens, right? It only happens if it happens by mistake, and I can have forgotten different kinds of things. You're going to see actually over the course of the next week, but I can forget that I'm ritually impure, and then I can walk into the temple not knowing that I'm ritually impure. Or I can walk into an area that I don't realize is the temple, even though I know I'm ritually impure. So that's going to kind of divide the Yediot HaTumah into the different categories. So far that makes sense. I see that there is something in the chat, and I just want to, okay. Yes, still some people who are learn the Mishnah by singing it. It's true. And it's true of a lot of Torah also. Learning Ta'ameh HaMikra, I think, really helps people learn things like this by heart. So anyway, Shevuot, Yediot HaTumah, Yetziot HaShabbat, and Marot Negaim, those are four things that don't necessarily seem related. We kind of understand that the reason why this list maybe is here the way it is because of some kind of orality, right? That there's something to having this list here, but we'll see shortly that even though Yetziot HaShabbat and Marot Negaim don't show up at all over the course of the rest of the Masechet, Yediot HaTumah, funnily enough, do. And what we're going to see is actually Mishnah Bet, which I know isn't on the roster yet for today, but Mishnah Bet actually brings us into what turns out to be a very long conversation, even before we start talking about Shevuot, about Yediot HaTumah. So I'm just gonna read this quickly because the nitty-gritty of it you don't have to understand yet. But kol sheyesh b'yedi'ah batchila v'yedi'ah b'sof v'helem b'intayim harei zeh be'olav yored. So a situation in which I knew at one point, let's say, that I was impure, and then I mess up and walk into the temple having forgotten that I was impure, and then at some point later on realize, oh no, I was impure, right? Then I bring this korban olav yored. And Ravad Mibar Nur clarifies all of this, Yediot HaTumah Kai. This Mishnah Bet, is talking about Yediot HaTumah, even though what we just saw here, right? On the list of four things, the first one was Shevuot, the second one was Yediot HaTumah, the Masechet is called Masechet Shevuot, and yet the second Mishnah brings us into the land of Yediot HaTumah, and that becomes the main topic of conversation for the first two prakim of the Masechet. This is just, it clarifies a little bit more about the Yediot HaTumah. We can skip it for now. And this, if I give you, right, this is a chart of the 8 prakim that appear, 8 prakim in the Masechet, with a basic description, I would say a very, very basic description of the topic of each Masechet. The first 2 prakim, right, the first parak really is about which kinds of korban chata, which kinds of sacrifices atone for which kinds of tum'ah, and they're very specific. The different holidays each come with their own korban chata, and some of them atone for this and some of them atone for that, but all of that being broadly about the Yediot HaTumah. And then parak bet is also really a deep dive into not Shevuot, Yediot HaTumah, into how I can forget and remember and where I go and what kind of sanctity the temple courtyard has and what kind of sanctity which places in the temple have. All of that really is the discussion for the first 2 prakim before we even touch Shevuot themselves. Then the next 6 prakim really start to talk about different kinds of Shevuot about personal things, Shevuot to do with testimony, Shevuot to do with, right, if a Shevuah that I take to say that to deny that I stole money, something like that. But really, these are the prakim that are the prakim about Shevuot. And these first 2 prakim, even though they really kick off Masechet Shevuot, are not about Shevuot. So that's really our first kind of big structural question about this Masechet is, what are these first 2 chapters doing here? Sure, it's on the Shnayim Shehem Arba list. That's fine. But Yetziot HaShabbat and Marot Negaim, which are also on the Shnayim Shehem Arba list, don't we don't get any time with them really. So that's I think big question number one is really what is the role that that Yediot HaTumah play in the Masechet, and we'll see that there's a sort of a biblical textual explanation that seems a little bit obvious, but I think there's actually a lot that biblical textual explanation holds within it something that's much deeper. But that's question number one. Up until now, any questions, thoughts, comments?
I had a question. I guess is
Yeah, go for it.
part of the purpose of outlining these four concepts to suggest some analogy in how one would go through one, sort of they're all subject to the same rules or something like that? I mean, why are they set out the four at all?
The four, the Yetziot
Four- the
HaTumah.
four
So
cooking.
so the four at the beginning. These four.
Yeah, like you're right? Is it
Um,
to suggest that by deep diving into
so-
one, you could apply principles to the others, or something?
Exactly. So I think that there's and I think this is a big question in general in terms of people who try to look at the Mishnah literarily, and I think this has become a big conversation with when the more people have started thinking about the orality of the text, is that which kinds of things are we looking for literary explanations for, and which kinds of things, or do we kind of or are we happy to not I wouldn't say dismiss, but are we happy to explain what kinds of explanations are we looking for and feel compelling to us? So if this weren't an oral text, let's put it that way, then I would think that for sure everything on this list, I would think there's a reason why it's there. Personally, I'm inclined to want to look for a deeper answer, like the kinds of like what you were alluding to, I think, about Yediot HaTumah, because it ends up taking up space in the Masechet. I think once you have two things that share this, it's funny. There's something maybe literarily interesting about the fact that we've got a list of four, and then two of them end up being important, and two of them being a secondary, given that this list of four is the Shtayim Shem Arba list, right? Like I don't quite think that's an accident. But I think I certainly am looking. I would be more inclined to read into the similarities between Shevuot and Yediot HaTumah than I would be inclined to look into deeper similarities between them and Yetziot HaShabbat and Marot Negaim. I think we'll see next week, but I think with Marot Negaim, there might be a little bit more there than meets the eye. I'm not convinced that there is with Yetziot HaShabbat, but if you end up having ideas about that, I would love to hear them. Thanks, Jessica. Anyone else? Or should we move on? Okay. So that's big question number one. Big question number two, I want to think about the last six prakim, which are the prakim that are actually about Shevuot. And to think about the order that they come in and really how those last six prakim are split. And in order to do that, I think we need a brief explanation of what the different kinds of Shevuot that we will see here are. There are six different prakim, each of which talk about its own kind of Shevuah. And we're really just gonna do a little bit of a quick run through of the different types of Shevuot, and this will hopefully also be helpful as you start to encounter each of them as you learn these prakim. But the third parak deals with the kinds of it deals with Shevuot between Shevuot and Shevuot Shav. Just a quick note about the names of the prakim. These are the names of the prakim are always the first couple words of the parak. So the first word of the first Mishnah of the parak, and it happens to be that parak 1 and parak 3 both start with the words Shevuot Shtayim Shem Arba. So on the top of the page, it's parak Shevuot Shtayim, and then the first parak is parak Shevuot Shtayim, comma, aka parak Shevuot Shtayim 1, and the second one is parak Shevuot Shtayim 2. So that's just the explanation. But parak 3, which is about Shevuot between Shevuot Shav, in some ways, those are, I think, the most intuitive kinds of Shevuot that people make. Sort of the kinds of oaths that people make when they swear to each other about personal matters, or swear to themselves that they want to swear to only be vegan for the next 7 months. A famous biblical example, right, when Yaakov swears to Lavan that nobody took the trafim, right? So one of those is about a shvuah about something that I will do. One of those is a shvuah about something that I did or didn't do. And Shevuot Shav, which is a category of I can take a shvuah about something that could be totally impossible or implausible. And that, right, that's considered a Shevuot shav, but it's also within this context of a totally personal, right? It's not part of any public, ceremonial, institutional, legal context at all. Emily, did you have your hand up? Okay, great. Those are Shevuot Bitui, Shevuot Shav. That's the subject of the third parak. The fourth and fifth parak deal with Shevuot Ha'idut and Shevuot HaPikadon. Shevuot Ha'idut is misleading because nowadays, if I were to say what is a Shevuot Ha'idut and testimony oath, we know from our contemporary courts of law that before witnesses testify, what do? They get sworn in. That's not what this is. So a Shevuot Ha'idut is an oath that a person takes, not necessarily within a courtroom context, but an oath that a person takes that they have nothing to say in court. Okay, in a witness, and this is actually interesting, and we'll get to this. I think it bears naming now. Witnesses don't swear, don't take oaths in halacha, and this is a spontaneous oath that a person can take, or it can happen in the context in a courtroom context, but where a person is being asked to testify about something that they're supposed to know about, and claims that they have nothing to say. Yep. Shevuot HaPikadon is when a defendant denies that they are guilty in a monetary context. So if someone lent someone else something and then claims that it was stolen or that it was lost in some way that person's not negligent for, in many cases, that's one common example. Basically an oath that I don't owe you any money, more or less. And in those cases, and in that case, if a person swears falsely, they'll also be punished. Shevuot Ha'idut, Shevuot HaPikadon, make those concepts make sense? Okay. What ends up happening in that's the subject of the fourth and the fifth parak. The sixth parak, really through the eighth parak, is what's called Shevuot HaDayanim. The sixth parak is called Shevuot HaDayanim, but that kind of broad category continues through the end. And these are the Shevuot that are courtroom procedural oaths, right? This is the kind of stuff that I think we're more familiar with from our day-to-day experience, right? That's where the picture comes in. And there are three biblical kinds of oath that fall under this category. This breakdown, by the way, the Mishnah doesn't explicitly make this breakdown. It starts later, but all of these appear already in rabbinic texts. There are three circumstances when, according to Torah law, according to biblical law, they're in court, a person is obligated to swear. Those are going to be a case of modeh b'miktzat, or partial admission. And that's the subject of chapter 6 of Masechet Shevuot. So let's say, for example, Yonah lends me $1,000 and then comes up to me after a month and says, Shalhevet, where's my $1,000? And I say, what are you talking about? I already paid you back 500 of those dollars. I only owe you 500 now. What I'm supposed to do? Pay you back those 500 and swear on the rest. And in court, right, according to Torah to law, the court can make me swear on those last 500. Worth noting that if I deny it all, if I say, what are you talking about? I've never met you. Not true. The court does not require me to take an oath. I get off scot-free. According to rabbinic law, I still might have to take an oath, but it's considered to be less significant, less important. But the Torah law oath is for a modeh b'miktzat, someone who partially admits. Chapter 7 deals with, actually, I guess I did this in order of chapters, not in order of severity, but deals with rabbinic level prohibitions. So sorry, not prohibitions, rabbinic level oaths. So oaths that are not really part of the Torah law framework, but are rabbinic innovations or rabbinic takanot. And these are certain circumstances in which of the nishba'im v'notlim, the people who situations in which a plaintiff actually takes an oath. The most common example, or not the most common, but an easy example to think about is sometimes in an employee-employer relationship, right, of a worker. So if I'm an employer who has hired 500 people to work for me, And the Torah or the courts or whatever don't expect me to know exactly who I paid their salary to and who I have not yet paid their salary to for that day. So a worker can come and claim his salary and is required by rabbinic law, by D'Rabbanan law, to take an oath, and then can collect. That's an example. There are other ones. So that's chapter 7. Chapter 8 deals with Shevuot HaShomrim. That was the one. That's the example of the diamond necklace that was left in my possession. And let's say I say so that something happened to it. I'm basically swearing that I wasn't negligent with it, that I didn't steal it, that I didn't use it. That's what chapter 8 deals with. And then there's something interesting, and hopefully we'll maybe get into this when we get into later in the Masachet. But the third in the big category of deoraita oaths that are taken in court, type number 3 is the Shevuot Eid Echad of a single witness. So you guys, if anyone here just learned Sanhedrin, then you will know that the Torah says Al pi shnayim edim yakum davar, right? If there are, in general, if there are 2 witnesses against me, then the plaintiff can collect money. And if there are no witnesses, then he's kind of out of luck. If there's 1 witness, then I, in response to that 1 witness, have to take an oath that I'm in order to get myself off the hook. That's like we just did like a big seker of all of the, or a big survey of really all the topics and all the different kinds of oaths that come up in the Mishnah. But right, that these Eid Echad, Modeh B'Miktzah, Shomrim, and Nishba'im V'Noflim are all sort of part of this Shevuot HaDayanim framework, meaning that there's the Shevuot that are mandated to take in court. And that's really the topic of chapters 6 through 8. One thing that I think becomes clear, though, is that when we think about, let's say, Shevuot HaDayanim versus all the stuff that we talked about before, Shevuot HaPikadon, Shevuot HaEdut, and Shevuot Bitoy, and it'll become even more clear when you look at the Mishnah, that chapters 3 through 5 are really answering a different question than chapters 6 through 8. And right, let's put aside the first 2 chapters for a second, but thinking about the chapters 3 through 5, the real question that the Mishnah is dealing with is, what are the penalties for swearing falsely, and under what conditions do those penalties apply? We'll see it in chapter 3, but let's say I take an oath that I never ate. A lot of the oaths in chapter 3 are about like things that one ate or didn't eat, which is also just an interesting point. But let's say I take an oath that I ate bread, and then there's like a question about like, if you ate oat bread, are you chayav or not? Like that's like a classic example of the kinds of questions that happen in chapters 3 through 5. Whereas chapters 6 through 8 are really asking a different question. They're saying, under what conditions is a litigant legally required to take an oath, right? We see it even when we look at the meanings of the word chayav and patur as they show up in chapters 3 through 5 and versus chapters 6 through 8. So anyone wanna take a stab at Gimel Daled as it shows up here? Someone wanna? Monique, it looks like you're reading, but you're muted, so I can't hear you. No. Oh, you weren't? No, never mind. Emily, yeah, thank you so much. Great. Thanks.
If nobody else. Okay. Kor tvua yesh li biyadecha, ein li biyadi ela letech.
Letech, it's a unit, measurement, yeah.
Letech kitniot, patur.
Okay, you can even just stop there right now, but right, so this is an example of Perek, right, the Perek Vav through Chet, the 6th through 8th Perek, right? So it's the example of the Modeh B'Miktzah case, right? The case of a partial admission. So someone claims that they lent me a bunch of grain, and I respond that actually it was only a partial amount of beans. So the question is, am I required to take this oath of a partial admission? Is this considered a partial admission enough that I'm required to take that oath? And in this case, I'm patur, meaning I'm not required to take that oath. Let's just see the meaning of the word patur when it shows up in Perek Gimel. Emily, do you mind just taking the? Yeah,
it means exempt. If the claimant said I have
but here
the claimant said I have a core of grain in your possession, and the defendant responded, you only have half core of legumes in my possession, he is exempt. So does that mean exempt from making an oath? From the
Exactly. It means exempt from making an oath. And we'll see, like there in all the examples there, it means that's not considered enough of an admission to be required to take an oath. Whereas, do you mind reading the second Mishnah and seeing the meaning of the word patur there?
Was that supposed to be the first, actually?
That was supposed to be the first. Yes, exactly.
שבועה שלא אוכל ואכל אכלים שאינן ראויים לאכילה ושתה משכין שאינן ראויים לשתייה, פטור.
Right. If I take an oath that I haven't eaten, but I ate something that is not edible, I ate dog food, I don't know, then I am patur. I'm not patur from taking an oath. I already took the oath, right? I'm patur from bringing the sacrifice that I would have had to bring if I did the thing wrong. So really, I think it becomes clear, and you will see it as we get through these prakim, that chapters 3 through 5 are just it's a different question that they're asking than what they're asking in chapters 3 through 6. And it's interesting, if you look at the way, I think often when people are thinking about the structure of the Mishnah, one interesting strategy to take is to compare it to the structure and the breakdown in the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam, which is organized differently. The Mishnah Torah of the Rambam is often actually organized in a way that is in some ways a lot more coherent, certainly at first glance, than the Mishnah is. And if you look at the place where the halachot that show up in each of these prakim of the Mishnah largely show up in the Rambam, what's called Hilchot Shevuot in the Rambam, and there is a Hilchot Shevuot in the Rambam, really only deals with chapters 3 through 5. Chapters 6 through 8, which are chapters about under what conditions, again, is a litigant legally required to take an oath. That's really the question that chapters 6 through 8 are dealing with. Those topics are discussed in the Rambam in Hilchot To'in V'Nit'an, right? Basically the halachot of litigants, halachot of shiur, right? That's where all the questions about a shomer, about a guardian's oath, shows up. But it really, as a part of the Rambam's broader dealing with courtroom procedure in general, and the question of Shevuot that we see in the Rambam really is only about the conditions under which a false oath or or what constitutes an oath that has legal weight, such that if I do it falsely, I'm liable for lashes to bring a sacrifice, depending on the situation. So right, that 3 through 5 and 6 through 8 really asking a different question. And if I were to ask, if any of you were here for the last couple of different masechtot that we saw in the Mishnah thus far, right now we're in Seder Nezikin. The topics that we've dealt with have included tort law, civil law, and then really Sanhedrin and Makot primarily deals with the structure of the judicial system and the legal system, and how it operates. And if I were to ask you which group of prakim here feels most at home in it, or feels like maybe a most natural continuation of what we've seen so far in Seder Nezikin, at least I would think that the obvious answer is the last 3 prakim, right? The last 3 prakim get at the fundamental, right? Get at the questions of legal procedure of how the judiciary is structured, and then I might even have thought that maybe that would be where we would start, because that feels like, again, a natural continuation of the conversations that we've had before. It feels very at home in a lot of ways in Nezikin, because it really is about courtroom procedure. The discussion of the penalties in Shevuot HaEdut and Shevuot HaPikadon, sure, I think they're on some level are tangentially related to what's going on in Nezikin, in part because they have some point of contact with courtroom proceedings, right? Testimony and pledges are definitely part of, right? There are litigants involved. It's part of this kind of broader courtroom question, but especially when it comes to the first 3 chapters, it's really it's not so clear what they're doing in Seder Nezikin at all. So, sorry. Really thinking about the relationship between Masechet Shevuot and the context in which it shows up. In some ways, it seems like chapter 6 through 8 seem to fit much better in the context of Nezikin as a whole. So I think, right, there's this question of why does the Masechet start with penalties rather than procedures in the first place, and why does it, even within the context of the penalties rather than procedures, it's starting with the kinds of, even with in the oaths, the kinds of oaths that really have nothing to do with Nezikin at all. So I think these are really the big questions that I think a broad overview of the Masechet really, like, these are the questions that I think stick out, right? What's going on with these first two chapters? And then within the conversation about Shevuot, why is it that we've sort of relegated all the courtroom procedure stuff, which seems to fit really well into Seder Nezikin, to the end? Is that because they're secondary in some way? And how can we think about the way that this Masechet is built in light of where it stands in the context of the Masechet on the whole? Okay. I think we're gonna turn to hopefully start answering those questions. But before that, I just wanted to make sure if anyone has any questions or comments that you want to pop in with. If not, totally fine. Yeah, Ido, it looked like maybe no. It looked like you maybe had a finger up, but no. Okay, great. Okay, so I think in order to start really understanding what some of this might all be about, let's go back to the second Mishnah, which we saw very briefly, and really the last couple of words of the second Mishnah. So kol sheyesh, I'll just read it for time's sake. Kol sheyesh ba yedi'ah b'tchila v'yedi'ah b'sof v'ha'elem b'intayim harei zeh be'olav yored. So this, again, Barton Neuer told us this is talking about the Yediot HaTumah. It's not talking about Shevuot, but situations in which I knew at the beginning and I knew at the end and I forgot in the middle, that was the time when I sinned. That is when I am liable to bring an olav yored. An olav yored is a specific type of korban. What is particular about this type of korban is that the content of it can depend on how much money a person has. So most of the time when it comes to sacrifices, you do something wrong, you're supposed to bring a sheep, or you're supposed to bring a goat, or whatever it is. With an olav yored, you're ideally supposed to bring an animal. If you can't afford an animal, you can bring a grain offering, and you can bring birds. And if you can't afford that, you can bring grain offering. And it's a more flexible kind of korban. And there, I don't know if any of you guys had already seen the Mishnah today. I don't know if any of you are learning it with Kahati. But Kahati will already point this out to you on a more textual level, which is that the olav yored, I think, is the key to understanding the relationship between, or at least a door into understanding the relationship between Shevuot and Yediot HaTumah, which is that both of them give you both of them false oaths and the cases of Tumat Mikdash v'Kodashav end in a korban olav yored. So we're going to look here at the four cases that show up in Vayikra Perek Hey, which is where this korban olav yored is described. And we're going to see what the cases that are listed here are. Anyone else want to volunteer to read? English is also really fine if you want to read English. If not, I might volunteer Emily again.
I'm
Who's been doing great. Thank you.
I want to give you a break. Okay.
Thanks. Okay. Awesome. Let's take it one pasuk at a time.
Okay. V'nefesh ki techata v'sham'a kol alav v'hu eid o ro'eh o yodea o ra'a o yada im lav yagid v'nosei nasa avono.
I'm realizing that underlining the words really made it tougher to read them, because then all the nikud goes away. So yeah. Okay. So case number one is a person who sham'a kol Allah. He heard a Allah. Not totally clear what the public imprecation, I think, is what the translation here says, which is not helpful. But it's a curse or an oath, and we'll see that the rabbinic tradition understands it to mean an oath. And he was a witness to something, and he didn't say it. Okay. The im lo yagid, it's a kriyav there, it's funky. So that's case one. Case two, Emily.
או נפש אשר תיגע בכל דבר טמא, או בנבלת חיה טמאה, או בנבלת בהמה טמאה, או בנבלת שרץ טמא, ונעלם ממנו והוא טמא והשם.
Hashem, yeah. So a person who touches something tameh, right? I touch a carcass or something like that, which then means that I become tameh, right? That's the ritual purity. I guess when Mishnah Yomit gets to all of Taharot, then we'll understand that a lot more. But assume a person who touches an avatumah, or something that, let's say a carcass, will contract ritual impurity, and therefore, and under those circumstances, will not be allowed to enter the temple or do things like that. And this is a situation where someone touched something impure and sinned because of it. Keep going.
או כי ייגע בטומאת אדם לכל טומאתו אשר יטמא בה, ונעלם ממנו והוא ידע ואשם.
Okay, so here a very similar case, but instead of touching animal impurity, I touched tumat adam, so a person who usually because of either because of some sort of bodily function is impure. So if that happens, or if that happens to me, or if I touch a person to whom that happened, and then same deal. And then case number 4.
או נפש כי תשבע לבטא בשפתיים להרע או להיטיב לכל אשר יבטא האדם בשבועה ונעלם ממנו והוא ידע ואשם לאחת מאלה.
Okay, so this is a person who, and here finally we see the word Shevuot, but the first pasuk might have been referring to Shevuot. For sure, pasuk Dalet here is referring to Shevuot, a person who articulates an oath, right, in any kind of direction, forgets about it and then sins, right? I swear not to go across the street, and then I forget about it and I cross the street. So, right, and then here's the penalty. It's the person Emily, you don't have to read it this time. Brings a sacrifice, and if they can't afford the tzon, then they bring the birds, and if they can't afford the birds, then they bring the solet, the flour, the fine flour. That's the korban ulav yoreh, and that applies to the above cases and only to the above cases. So what are the above cases? A person who neglects to testify, there's a kol Allah involved there. Neglecting to testify in response to some kind of kol Allah, which the rabbinic tradition understands to be a person being mashbiahim, basically making the person take an oath that they're not going to testify. Sound familiar? Animal impurity and human impurity, both resulting in unintentional sin, which is going to be associated with some interacting with some kind of kedusha, something sacred, walking into the temple, or an oath that results in unintentional sin. So really, right, what are cases 2 and 3? They're the yediot hatumah that show up in Prakim Aleph through Bet. The fourth pasuk here is referring more or less to Shevuot Bitoy, the subject of Perek Gimel of the 3rd Perek. And the rabbis understand this Shama'a Kol Allah to be referring to the situation described here is the situation of Shevuot HaEdut. So now we've got a simple textual explanation, at least at first, of really what at least the beginning of this Masechet has in common, right? The first half of the Masechet are talking about the subjects of the Korban Olav Yored, right? This is, and Shevuot are not the only thing that enter into this category, but right, maybe we shouldn't call this Masechet Shevuot, maybe we should call it Masechet Korban Olav Yored. Right now, we thought that the first 2 prakim were outliers, but now maybe we can break things down differently. Maybe it's not the first 2 chapters that are outliers and the last 6 that go together, but actually maybe the first 4 have something in common. But I'm not satisfied with that as an explanation just in and of itself, because then, right, that sort of begs the question of why is the Torah lumping them all together? Which is really to say, what is it about Yediot HaTum'ah and Shevuot, right? What's shared between them? Why do they have the same punishment? And why do they appear in the same place in the Torah? And I think in order to understand that, I think we can start to get an understanding of that if we look at really the psukim that forbid, or that forbid taking false oaths and false testimony. At least one of these psukim I think is a pretty famous one because it is in the 10 Commandments, which is let's start with the first one. Emily, you wanna take it away?
לא תישא את שם אדוני אלוהיך לשווא, כי לא ינקה אדוני את אשר יישא את שמו לשווא.
Right. This is within the rabbinic tradition considered the kind of azhara for a Shevuot Shav, right? The warning against don't take a Shevuot Shav. And how is it described? It's described as lisa et Hashem, which literally means to take or to lift the name of God in vain. And the second pasuk, which this one is from Parshat Kedoshim.
ולא תשאבו בשמי לשקר, וחיללת את שם אלוהיך אני אדוני.
Right, so don't take my name in vain, because it would profane the name of God. And I think really the word chilalta sham, the word chilalta there, I think tells us something a little bit deeper about what's going on with a shvuah, and maybe even what it has in common with the idea of temple purity and impurity. Right, when I walk into the temple when I'm impure, right, I'm profaning a sacred space. And the way that the Torah imagines or describes a shvuah, right, and its power is that I'm invoking on some level God's name, and God's name also has a kind of sanctity. And to do that, and to do that, and then to violate it, right, to take an oath that I will do something and then to fail to do it, or to take an oath in which I swear falsely about something that happened in the past, or that I don't have testimony or something like that, right, that's a way of, on some level, profaning the name of God. And it's a kind of chilul hakodesh. The word chol there, or chilul, right? Chol is the opposite of kodesh, right? And so, really, when we think about, this is also just an amazing. If people say Shir Shal Yom on Sunday, I think this juxtaposition is maybe one of the most kind of beautiful examples of this from Sefer Tehillim, right? We said also when we're bringing back the Sefer Torah, but these two psukim here, psukim Gimel and Daled, when the Mishorer in Sefer Tehillim asks, Mia ale behar Hashem, right? Who is entitled to go up to the mountain of God to take up sacred space? Mia kum bimkom kocho, a person who's nekicha paim uvar levav asher lo nasa l'shav nafshi, right? The Tehillim is linking the idea of God's name and God's domain or space as both being kinds of sacred, and that a person who is worthy, or the kind of person who might be worthy of inhabiting or of treading in sacred space, can only be the kind of person who would never be mechalel God's name, who would never profane God's name, a person who has not been nishba l'mirma. So when we think about really the beginning, or at least these first two chapters, and what do they have in common with the subject matter of Shevuot as a whole, part of what's going on here is that, right, the Shevuot, part of what the power of a Shevuot is it attaches the power and sanctity of God's name to our words, right? And then it's on some level, it's like a huge chiddush here that we can, even from the fact that the subject matter of these two prakim are placed here with Shevuot, that really part of what's going on with Shevuot are they have the same kind of power and sanctity as that of the Beit HaMikdash.
Is it from the biblical text that you just showed for the source? It was saying, swearing in God's name. Is the implication that all swearing would be swearing in God's name, or is it a subset of swearing?
Okay, so it's actually a really interesting question that, believe it or not, is not totally explicitly answered in the Mishnah itself, and actually ends up being a machloket that continues even into the medieval era, whether a shivua, whether an oath can be considered, whether it can have chalut, whether it can basically, whether it can count as an oath that has the, if it doesn't include God's name. But I think even according to the opinions that think that it doesn't, and the Mishnah almost sort of discusses this, because the Mishnah discusses the relationship between Yud Kei Vav Kei, right, like God's real name, the Tetragrammaton, and other kinds of names that we have for God. So like God or Elohim or anything like that. Those, it seems pretty clear, do count. And the question is whether those count, but swearing by Jove or whatever doesn't count. Right, it's clear that certain kinds of oaths don't count. If I swear by the mountains, not a good oath. But even according to the opinions that I think that you don't necessarily need to say God's name explicitly, I think the only reason why, and we see that based on what doesn't count, the reason why they count as an oath despite that is because there's at least an implicit invocation of God's name, right? God's name isn't, and it's a discussion of, I believe it's a machloket Rambam and the Ran, but even if you think that it doesn't require God's name, maybe what that's saying is like, okay, an oath isn't an incantation, right? It's not that I'm saying the magic words that then like make a thing, right? That then make some kind of lightning bolt fall from the heaven. But it's that what I'm doing when I swear is that I'm basically staking my claim on God's name. And that staking my claim on God's name, whether or not I need to literally verbalize God's name in order for that to count, either way, right? The kedusha, right? The same way that kedusha, right? That holiness and sanctity in general, right? It can inhabit space. It can inhabit physical objects like food. It can inhabit a name, right? That we can invoke it in a lot of different ways, physical or otherwise. Okay. So that's really, I think, the big question number one. And I think very quickly, I think that will give us also a window into how our other questions and how the relationship between that and the end of the Masechet all fit together. So far, that really explained these first four prakim. But then the question is, okay, so what about Shevuot HaPikadon, right? What's the relationship between Shevuot HaPikadon, which we saw, and the earlier ones? And how do all of that, right? How does all of that fit into, right? How do chapters 3 through 5 about the penalties for false oaths fit into, right? What's the relationship between that and the kind of procedural oaths that we see as part of courtroom procedure that seem to fit more naturally into Seder Nezikin more broadly? So, and right, that'll take us to the end, I think. So Shevuot HaPikadon also shows up in Vayikra Parak in the 5th parak of Leviticus, but we get the penalty is actually a different korban, a different sacrifice. And the psukim, I'm just gonna read it for time purposes. The psukim that discuss it, it's a little bit later, and it comes actually after a number of other different not oath related crimes. And we see that a nefesh ki techata u'ma'ala ma'al barunai v'chichesh b'amito b'fikadon o v'tzumet yad o v'gazel o ashakad amito. So a person who deals deceitfully with another in the matter of a deposit or a pledge or through robbery or whatever. So I have something in my hands that belongs to someone else, and I do the wrong thing with it. Oh, matzaveda, right? I found something that belonged to you, and I did the wrong thing with it. V'chichesh ba, and I what does it say here? Lied about it. V'nishba al shaker, and I swore falsely about it. Any of those cases, there, the punishment is a couple of different things. There are actually 3 components to the punishment. So the punishment includes v'hishivat hagzela asher gazal. Seems pretty intuitive. I have to return the thing that I stole. Oh, no, oshek asher shak, blah blah blah, everything else. Omikol, right? Omikol asher yishava alav v'sheker. V'shilemoto v'rosho v'chamishito yosif alav. So you have to pay it back and add a 5th, which is we'll see in a moment, but is a kind of punishment that often goes with mit'ila, or misuse of temple property. Interesting and worth noting that ashamo yavi ladonai, right? It has to bring an asham, a korban asham, which is different from a korban ulav yored. It's supposed to specifically be a korban of tzon, of sheep. So on some level, right, the Shevuot HaPikadon looks in some ways kind of similar to the other Shevuot that we saw earlier, and that there's a sacrifice brought. But on the other hand, it contains this whole other component, which I'll call the Ben Adam L'Chavero component, right? There's clearly part of what the problem here is that I stole from a person, and part of repentance for what I did wrong involves returning the thing that I stole from the other person. And so already in Shevuot HaPikadon, we see that there's this kind of it walks the line a little bit between the world of Ben Adam L'Chavero and Ben Adam L'Makom and Ben Adam L'Chavero. And then, so right, Vayikra Parak shows up in the that conversation continues into the Shevuot HaPikadon, which on some level, right, shares a lot in common with the Shevuot that we saw previously, but also in some ways is different, and really starts to take us into the world of Ben Adam L'Chavero, take us into the world of kind of civil or interpersonal, right? The halachot that legislate civil law or interpersonal conduct. So that we can sort of start to see a picture, and I think I hopefully this is sort of becoming clear as we kind of look at the structure of the Masechet, having seen everything we've seen so far. But we sort of start to see a picture of a Masechet that really starts with a conversation that's happening entirely between me and God, and then as it goes, starts to become more and more about the relationships between human beings, and the institutions through which we're supposed to ensure kind of interpersonal justice. And I think that really will lead into a better understanding of what's going on in the context of Shevuot HaDayanim, right? Perek Vav Zayin Chet, the oaths that are taken in court, which is right the Shevuot HaDayanim that we saw before. Reminder, kind of the different oaths taken by the defendant, the motive mitzvah, the partial admission, the shomrim, the guardians, the eid achad. All of these are oaths that a person has to take in court. There's maybe a kind of obvious a question that maybe has a kind of obvious answer, but I think people often don't necessarily think about it, which is that, right, chapters 3 through 5, it's very clear what the penalties are for those oaths. That's in fact the subject matter of the entire Masechet, of those prakim. But when we think about the end, the Shevuot HaDayanim, I think there's the question is, sure, we see a lot in these mishnayot about, okay, when do you have to take this oath? When do you have to take this oath? When do you have to not take this oath? But the Mishnah itself there never explicitly says, okay, but what happens if you take one of those oaths and it turns out that you're lying, right? What is the penalty for all of these Shevuot HaDayanim, right? And the answer, I think, when we think about it, even though the Mishnah doesn't really ask it, becomes kind of obvious. And it's funny. Whenever the Rambam said, this is a quote from the Rambam's Mishnah Torah. Whenever the Rambam starts something with, "It is a clear and obvious fact," it maybe isn't so. It often means that it's not actually such a clear and obvious fact. But the Rambam wants to make, or at least what's happening here is I think the Rambam is making explicit something that it's actually kind of surprising, but has never been made explicit before. So the Rambam notes that davar barur v'galui, that shenishba Shevuot HaDayanin or Shevuot HaSeif b'sheker, right? That if a person makes one of these oaths of chapters 6 through 8 and lies about it, sheyehei chayav mishum Shevuot HaPikadon. Actually, right, everything that's happening in chapters 6 through 8, those are all the procedural rule. Those are all about procedural rules for a certain kind of oath. But if I take it and I swear falsely, I'm chayav mishum Shevuot HaPikadon. I get the punishment of a person who took a Shevuot HaPikadon. And then there's like a little bit of discussion of, okay, do you bring the korban? Do you get lashes? Depends on if it's intentional, unintentional. We can leave that for now because of time purposes. But that really, what the Rambam is telling us is that actually all of these prakim are about Shevuot HaPikadon. Prakim Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet are about Shevuot HaPikadon. And they give us the procedures for, right, the procedures under which a person is chayav to take that oath. But if you do it and you do it falsely, you're chayav for a Shevuot HaPikadon, which makes sense. But given that light, I think we can sort of see just maybe how radical the idea that people take oaths in court in the first place is. I think some of us, because nobody really takes oaths nowadays at all anymore, the main context in which we're familiar with oaths is from courts and watching Law and Order and seeing courtroom dramas. But the idea that there's a procedural oath within, kind of built into the judicial system, that under some circumstances a person is obligated to take, it's actually not obvious to the Torah, and I think especially the rabbinic mindset. The most blaring kind of example of that is the fact that a witness doesn't take an oath, right? Witnesses take the stand, and people take witnesses very, very seriously in the rabbinic tradition, and there's a whole process of cross-examination that witnesses undergo, but they're not standing in court like holding. We imagine it as like raise your right hand, but in in the rabbinic tradition, people hold a Sefer Torah in their hands, right, when they swear. And Jessica, maybe even that goes to the discussion that we were having about, do you have to explicitly take the name of God? So even if you don't explicitly have to take the name of God, if you're physically holding the name of God, then it sort of counts. The idea that a defendant would take an oath in court is kind of radical. And if we look at the psukim that describe the circumstances under which that happens, we'll understand a little bit, I think, more about why. A person is watching an animal that belongs to someone, right? So this is actually, here we really see that Shevuot HaShomrim and Shevuot HaPikadon are actually the same thing. A guardian's oath is an oath about a pledge or something that was left with me. So something was left with me and it died and no one saw, right? Then in that case, a Shevuot Hashem tihye bein shnehem, right? If the person is swearing that I didn't do anything wrong, but why? Because this is a case in which on some level the legal system has run out of other options, right? Usually when we have a legal system, that's what witnesses are for. That's what objective third parties are for. We want to try to get to the truth. And there are some situations where we can't get to the truth. And when that happens, all we have left to do is really ask the parties involved themselves, but we obviously don't want them to lie. And the combination of the having run out of other options and the gravity of the situation, what the Torah is telling us, like what's supposed to happen is that this person is going to take the name of God. And I think part of what the rabbinic tradition is realizing about this, or it wants to emphasize, is just how radical that move really is. And Yona, I know you had your hand up, but I wanna just, because I know we're running short on time, I want to get to the end really quickly, and then I'm very curious what you wanted to ask. And I think if we look back in light of that at the Shevuot HaPikadon, there's just a different piece of the pasuk that I want to emphasize. Meaning, I think it puts that Shevuah in a different light. A nefesh ki techata u'ma'ala ma'al b'Hashem, right? When a person commits a trespass against the Lord, but that language of ma'ol ma'al, right, is right, on some level is a language that is usually used to describe stealing from the temple treasury, or stealing from the Beit HaMikdash, or stealing from God. And the part of what happens when we invoke God's name in this legal traditional context is we're making it the case that what's at stake in this in the judiciary, what's at stake is the sacred, and is the name of God, and that part of what's happening, right, part of the whole story of Shevuot HaDayanim is bringing in the sanctity of the temple, the sanctity of God's name, into our very human, civil, legal proceedings, and that's no small thing, and that we ought to take that really seriously. The very beginning, and I think if we kind of look at the breakdown of the Masechet the way it is, we can see sort of that. I could have thought of civil procedures and the different civil procedures really as separate from the whole conversation about the sacred and about temple, but part of what the Mishnah is doing, especially when it's built by building the conversation this way, is it's priming us to think of Shevuot HaDayanim and to think of the legal system and the judicial system as not separate from right, as a domain that isn't separate from the domain of the sacred, that isn't separate from the domain of God and the temple, and that part of what enables the Torah's society to ensure justice is through invoking the sacred in this way. There's a moment in the very beginning of the 6th parak of Shevuot, and really this is the opening gambit of the 6th parak in the Gemara, where it describes the courtroom procedure before a person takes an oath, and it describes. I'm just going to read it in English because our time really is out. That it describes basically the scare tactics that the judges use before the defendant takes the oath. And the judges say to him, "Be aware that the entire world trembled when the Holy One, blessed be He, said at Mount Sinai, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain." Right? And it keeps going. With regard to all other transgressions in the Torah, God clears the guilt of the guilty. But here, when you take a false oath, lo yinakeh, ever. You're never gonna clear. With regard to all other transgressions of the Torah, the punishment is only exacted from you. But if you swear falsely, the punishment will be exacted from you and your children forever. And with regard to all other transgressions of the Torah, it's going to be only from you. But here, it's actually not just you and your family; it's the entire world. And that the moment before a person stands there in court, it's not just, do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. It's like, this is invoking the name of God is like one of the most serious things that you can possibly imagine. And on some level, I think that the structure of the Mishnah is kind of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's way of doing those scare tactics. Right? The same way that the judges before an individual case of an oath, but the same way that the judges try to kind of invoke the gravity and the sanctity of these judicial proceedings themselves, so too, right, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the editor or redactor of the Mishnah, is kind of helping us see that the judicial courtroom procedures, and in particular this moment where all other options run out and what we have to do is invoke the name of God, that really that in of itself is invoking and bringing into the courtroom the sanctity of God's name, the same kind of sanctity that exists in the temple, or once existed in the temple, and hopefully that will enable us to build a society that takes seriously questions of truth and falsehood. So with that, I wish you all much luck in your learning of this Masechet, and hopefully that gravity will kind of, you'll taste it as the Masechet goes on. The next week is really about the temple and the sacred, and it's a bit of a slog, but I think an opportunity for some really interesting insights. Thank you so much. I also know that I went over time, so if people want to go, they should totally go. But also, if anyone has any questions, I would love to hear and talk about them if anyone's interested. Thanks so much.
Shalhevet, if people have questions they want to get in touch with you about, what is the best way for them to do that?
Probably email shalhevetya@gmail.com. Here, I can write it in the chat real quick, and
you can also reach out to Drisha, and I'm happy to pass along the question.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks so much. Yona, it looked like you had something to say, but that was a while ago, so I also hope I didn't answer it. And also, if you want to go, that's.
I found this tremendously energizing and just a wonderful disruptive series of questions. So first of all, let me say thanks so much for this whole shiur. Looking at the structure of the Masechet slide, I do have an alternate interpretation.
Give it to me. I would love to hear.
See what you think about this. I think that Shevuot are used in a Beit Din as a solution, not as verification. That is, having to take a Shevuah is a satisfying outcome to a conflict, and it's considered satisfying and a legible activity because of exactly what you were talking about, that it was such a part of people's lives, right? That this was a way that people had of regulating their own behavior within the family, to themselves, modulating accountability, in other words. And that, in turn, I think, has an interesting kind of like feeder stream relationship to the opening questions of the Otatuma, right? Which really challenge us to think about, well, how much lucidity do we really have actually about our own actions, about our own status, about things that happen? You know, in fact, we could drift in and out of certainty about, you know, even are we tamil, todo, etc. So I think, yeah, I want to suggest that as an alternative, particularly since I wonder if Shevuot aren't taken by Edim, as you so harifly point out, right? That seems to strongly suggest that it's not about verification. It's about accountability and outcome and solution. And also maybe because Edim can give their perspective. Actually, sorry, I'm doing that thing that I always hate when other people do in my class. Let me zip it there. And
I'm curious. I'm curious. I think there's a lot of what you said that a lot of which is like super interesting. And I want to make sure I understood the different things that you're saying and maybe try to respond to one or two of them. That makes one is that right, the idea that of Shevuot as a solution rather than as verification, which I think is actually in a lot of ways like that is a thread that actually I think is picked up throughout the rabbinic tradition, certainly with regard to some of the different kinds of Shevuot that are taken in court of Shevuot Adanim, in particular with regard to Shevuot HaShomrim, right? With regard to which actually, right, that's the oath that I take if I'm watching your object, and then I say a tornado hit my house and now I can't get back to you, but I promise it's not my fault, right? In that case, right, a lot of the later commentators will say some version of, right, of actually we all believe him originally that's what happened. Like mostly we believe him. What's the point of the Shvuah? It's kedei lefayes et bal habayit. It's a way of making the plaintiff or the person who lent the thing feel better, right? Because even he thinks probably nothing happened, but like I really just want to make sure that no one stole from me. So I think, and in some ways, what you're suggesting maybe actually fits that oath the best. And what's I think cool about that is that that's the oath that actually shows up at the end of the Masechet. That's how the Masechet closes, and that whole perek, if not for what you just suggested, is kind of unnecessary in our Masechet because all of the Dinei Shomrim, right, all of the laws of guardians and who has to take an oath versus who has to pay when, what kinds of responsibility and liability and all that shows up also in Bava Metzia. So it's a weird perek because that chapter, that 8th chapter, the Mishnah, it shows up here, and there's very little Gemara on it because a lot of that stuff we already saw in Bava Metzia. But I think maybe part of the reason why it shows up here at the end of our Masechet is maybe some version of to tell us just that. Actually, maybe none of us are ever sure about what happened. And that Yediot HaTumah also, right? Like there's and these Shevuot D'Rabbanan that happen that the plaintiff takes because we can assume that his employer doesn't know whether or not he paid his salary. That maybe there's something about this whole Masechet that's encouraging us to like take a step back and say all this stuff that we thought we were sure of, maybe we're not actually so sure. And how do we deal with that uncertainty? And then actually part of what the Korban, part of the institution of the Korban, most of the time Korbanot that are brought for sins that we don't know whether or not we like. Either we didn't know that we sinned unintentionally at the time when we sinned, or korban hasham talui, which is like we don't know at all whether the thing that we ate was the prohibited food or the other food. One of the things that's fascinating though about Shavuot is that Shavuot ha'idud and Shavuot ha'pikadon are I think the only examples in rabbinic in like the rabbinic tradition, but I might be wrong about that, where a person brings a korban of that type for something they did on purpose. Like if I knew that that's its own kind of interesting thread. But I think you're totally right in pointing out that there's something about uncertainty. Then the Yediot HaTumah maybe isn't only about bringing the gravity and bringing the sanctity into the conversation, but maybe also about bringing the uncertainty into the conversation. Maybe that's why they call it Yediot HaTumah and not, Tumat Mikdash V'Kodashav or whatever it is. But yeah, that's a really awesome point, Yana. Thank you. Awesome. Okay, with that, thanks everyone so much. And thank you, Kayla, for staying on for an extra 15 minutes. Yeah.
Well, be well, everyone. Take
Bye.
care. And hope to see you all next week.
Thank you.
Bye.